this will, let's see, work. Can you all see that?
Yep, we can see it.
Great. Let's see if I can. Are you seeing just the slide, or are you seeing like a big wide notes thing? If so, I'll move that down.
We seen the whole PowerPoint. So like both
Okay.
the panel on the left.
Okay. Let's see if I can make this a different view. Let's see if we can do. Sorry, I'm used to doing this on Teams. You guys are, using Zoom here. Let's see. What do I need to do?
Try slideshow.
Yeah. Do you want to go for the slideshow?
There you go.
Try slideshow.
Okay, great.
No, wait, no, you're on the same one.
No, it's not working.
Yeah.
No. Okay.
Do you want to share a different screen maybe, or is it?
It should be. This is showing it. Percent of I speak at full screen. Are you guys seeing it that way now?
No, still.
It's exciting. All right. Well, this is obviously a really great, first of all, a really great show of my technical skills and also of our great Microsoft technology. Yeah, usually it just does the
hit from the beginning.
Oh, there we go. There we go.
Okay, yeah, perfect. All right.
Okay, great. So today we are going to talk about, as I said, the value of telling your innovation story. I think that a lot of the work that you often do when you work with the Silicon Valley Innovation Center is really around like, okay, how do we actually enact digital transformation, whether that's technology or tools or process? And today we're going to just kind of take a little bit of a right turn and talk about why it pays to tell your story internally and externally. And, I'll say I speak from the perspective of working for Microsoft, but today I'm representing myself. What I can tell you is that at Microsoft, we believe that digital transformation is very important. Obviously, we've been on our own digital transformation journey. We work with a lot of customers to enact a digital transformation strategy, which looks really different for every company, right? For some folks, it's moving to the cloud. For some folks, it's new process. For some folks, it's new technology. And for a lot of companies, it's about thinking about innovation. So as we've enacted this journey, as we've done a bunch of things differently, we've really found that it's so important to both say to people outside the company, hey, this is what we're doing. It looks really different from what we did before. We're moving into the cloud. We're taking a growth mindset, all these different things. It helps with recruitment. It helps, analysts understand us better. It helps journalists understand us better. There's a lot of different reasons that we find it important to tell people our story. And then internally, what we found is that our employees need to understand what we're doing too, right? We can't just be like, hey, here's a new thing, go do it. We have to really bring them along and explain what we're doing and why we're doing it. And also, I think really importantly, show the success of our digital transformation. One thing we've learned is that digital transformation is also cultural transformation. So when you're asking people to try to do things new ways, when you're asking people to really think about innovation in a different way, what you see is that there's going to be some trial and error. People are going to be pushed out of their comfort zone. They're going to try things that don't work, and they need to understand that's okay, right? We're not going to have change in our company if we just keep doing things the same way, or if we never try anything that's risky or different. So, the part of this storytelling that I think has been sort of the hardest to come by for us, but ultimately the most successful, is authenticity. When you're telling your story about digital transformation, you're kind of you have to feel okay about talking about the times it didn't work out and talking about, the times that you tried things one way, but it turned out another way was better. So I'm going to talk a little bit about, how we tell our story, why we tell our story, and give a few examples of what stories we told. And then, spoiler alert, I'm going to ask you guys to go into some breakout sessions and think of some stories you want to tell. And we're going to do some brainstorming and maybe talk about some ways that we can work on your stories together to kind of think through this type of storytelling.
All right, awesome. So what we're gonna do is that we're gonna break you out in the breakout rooms, and then just discuss what is the story that you want to say, and then who's your audience and why do you want to share that story. So really just discuss it within your group. I know there has been different people from the different organizations, or people from the same organization. So maybe you can think about the story that you want to tell, that really something that that change your perspective, and then you can go from there. So let me go and create the breakout rooms, and then off we go.
Do you want to do the breakout rooms right now, Faz, or do you want to do the presentation first? How do you want to do it?
What do you feel? What do you feel like?
I mean, I'm almost wondering if we could talk a little bit first,
Okay,
and I can just
okay,
talk a little bit about
okay,
what that looks like, give people some tools, and I'm
okay,
wondering if then that gives them kind of a
okay,
better framework
okay,
for
okay,
what they want to do.
okay. Sounds good.
But I'm
Let
happy
me
to
just
hear
bring them
from
back.
folks.
Yeah. Sorry. Sorry.
That's
All
okay.
right.
Yeah, I won't make this too long, but I'm just kind of thinking like it might be helpful to have
Okay.
some grounding in like
Okay.
what kind of stories to look for.
Okay. Sounds good.
Um, so okay, so just to jump in here, I mean, I think the first thing to think about when you're thinking about digital transformation is owning your story. So what any company will see when they start making changes is people will talk about that, right? Journals will talk about it, employees will talk about it. Everybody talks about these things, and one thing that we've seen is that it's kind of important to get ahead of that. So if you're not owning your story, if you're not telling your own digital transformation story, the risk is that it is told for you. And with employees, I think that's really challenging because that telling it for you could be a real negative, right? Like they may be like talking about things in a negative way, or they may sort of interpret it as like change is bad, we don't like this. Externally, the risk is that people don't really see what you're doing. A lot of times when you do digital transformation, it's messy in the beginning. Change is hard, right? And then I think the third thing is there's stories that you have in your company that you want to tell in a certain way so people really understand the journey. At Microsoft, as Bob said, we do a lot of journalism style storytelling. So I'm a former journalist. There's a lot of other former journalists that I work with on my team as writers and videographers and producers. And the reason we do journalism style storytelling is because we want this storytelling to be very plain spoken, right? We want to talk to a mainstream audience. We don't want to assume technical knowledge. We want to reach a diverse and inclusive audience. And we want to explain to people what we're doing in a way that doesn't feel intimidating to them. And what we try to do is to choose the areas where we can engage and do this external kind of journalism style storytelling in a way that really highlights the work that we're doing that we really think is most indicative of our journey. So there's a few examples. These are actually a little bit old. Of stories that we've done that kind of illustrate that. The story on the left is a story about a proof of concept we did with Warner Brothers about storing data on glass. For us, that's a great innovation story, right? We've got a lot of data. We've got a lot of data centers. We've got to find more cost-effective and eco-friendly ways to store it. It was a real example of innovation, and it highlighted a customer with a real business need. Warner Brothers really needs to be able to store all of this aging film in a way that will live on forever. The second story is an example. Our chief technology officer wrote a book about his own origins in a very small town in the South, and growing up and going to college and becoming a person who is a technology leader, and talking about how do we bring some of that work back to rural America. And this third story is about, it was sort of the first of several stories we've been doing about what we call AI at scale, which is sort of large scale AI models that can be used by our customers and by us for a number of things. And so, for us, these are examples of stories that we really wanted to tell in our own voice, authentically, with journalism style storytelling. So people would see like, how, wow, Microsoft's really trying cool stuff. They're thinking about, technology in a certain way. They're thinking about society in a certain way. Like we're not just building AI here in Redmond. We're really thinking about how can that impact the world around us. And you'll notice we did these, really interesting visuals. Visuals are a really important part of our storytelling. And the goal of the storytelling is to get journalists and influencers to essentially plagiarize us. We're looking for this content to be picked up by journalists and influencers, but also to make sure that regular people understand what we're doing. When we look at our data, we see a ton of internal folks reading our stories, a lot of people at the company. So again, going back to building excitement within your company about digital transformation, this type of storytelling is really authentic, interesting, engaging journalism style storytelling can go a long way toward getting your employees excited. And here's a little bit of an example of how we see this storytelling play out. So we often see, and I do see that there's stuff in the chat. If folks have questions, feel free to just jump
No,
in
that's
too.
me.
Okay.
That's me. I will let you know.
Okay, sounds great. I'm happy to be interrupted. So what I wanted to, just show here is that, if you're sort of thinking about like, wow, well, why would I do this and who really picks it up? What we see is that when we tell these digital transformation stories in this like very approachable way, when we think about engaging visuals, when we use plain spoken language, we can get some pretty complex stories out there in a way that really shows our innovation. So, if you take the story on the right, another way that we're looking at storing data is with synthetic DNA. And you might think, well, that's a really complicated story to tell. But using journalism style storytelling, creating a really fun visual, and just really thinking through very carefully, how do we like explain this to people? We were able to get some great, coverage. There's an example here of how our storage on glass piece got picked up. I love this picture in the Daily Mail, because the Daily Mail, folks who are familiar with UK media know, is like a very, it's a lot of like Kim Kardashian did this. And so to see our Microsoft technology covered in the Daily Mail was a real win for me, because I felt like, wow, we are getting our digital transformation story out into the world. And this was a fantastic story about creating tools that help people who are blind and low vision identify people in the room, people who've given consent. And then, this last story is one of our most fun stories. We took a data center and dropped in the ocean so that we could test kind of what would happen if we had sort of a self-reliant data center in the ocean, and what we would learn from that. And then we actually ended up using it for some COVID-19 research. So a broad group of examples of stories where we really set out to say, how can we make some pretty complex and weird stuff understandable to a mainstream audience? We were really kind of thoughtful about the language that we used. And it did result in, a lot of folks writing some great stories about us.
Can I ask a question in between?
Absolutely.
One question: how do you select the different kind of stories? I guess you have hundreds of stories, and
Yes.
we heard a good example from Cisco, and Cisco has a kind of overall message, a kind of purpose for the company. So with a social impact or social benefit, and they're focusing in all the communication on this mega purpose. So how are you? Do you have something like this too? A reason why, or a mission for Microsoft, which is communicated, and how do you select this kind of stories, and how do they fit to the main vision or mission from the company?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's a really important thing to think about. I'm glad you brought it up. So you're right. Unfortunately, it's my job to say no a lot. We get people who bring us stories, and they're fantastic stories, and they're really doing amazing work. I mean, we have 180,000 employees. Of course, there's people doing all sorts of great stuff, but every story that we do has to accrue to our mission. And I would actually say, the longer I've done this job, the fewer stories I've done, which sounds counterintuitive, but what we've realized is it's better to put a lot of resources behind a few great stories than to kind of randomize people with a whole bunch of different stories. So what we do every 6 months, every half, we basically go to our communications and marketing leadership, and we ask them what their top 3 priorities is. Is it the cloud? Is it AI? Is it mixed reality? And that's our North Star. Every story needs to accrue to that mission, right? It has to accrue to those goals, because those are the goals our communications team is trying to drive. The second thing we consider is, does the story accrue to Microsoft's overall mission, which is to empower every person and organization to achieve more. So it has to be a story that has an element of human benefit to it. And then the third thing we look at is, does it adhere to a top communications goal? So is there a communications person at the company who is going to be reaching out to journalists and talking to them about it? And, when you kind of narrow it down to those 3 criteria, the reason I think it's a great question, and I'm glad you brought it up, you really only get to, for us on the AI and innovation side, it's about 30 great stories we do a year, right? And we're very comfortable with that. I think that when I first started at Microsoft, I was like, I'd been a journalist. I was used to publishing literally every day. And I was like, gotta do. And what we realized is that that's actually confusing to the market, right? What's more clarifying for them is if we say, like, right now, you'll see we're doing a lot of stories about data centers. There's a lot of really interesting innovation going on in data centers. We're doing a lot of stories about mixed reality. We announced Mesh for Teams. We're talking about the metaverse. That's a really interesting part of our business. And we're talking a lot about AI supercomputer. We just started talking about our partnership with OpenAI and our GPT-3 large scale model, because we do feel like that's something that customers really can benefit from, being able to benefit from these large AI models without creating them themselves. Does that answer the question, or do you have any follow-ups there?
No, thanks, great.
Okay, awesome. Yeah, thank you for asking. One last thing I want to touch on here, especially since we are talking about global companies, I'm assuming all of you think about global reach, is the importance of telling your story globally. So this is a story we did a couple years ago about a physical programming language that we created so that kids who are blind or low vision could learn to code literally by touching and programming with their hands. And the goal of this program always was for us to give it to another organization and have them implement it. It's actually sold now around the world. And one thing I would encourage you to use, especially given the technology that's available with Microsoft Translator or other products of your choice, is the ability to publish in multiple languages. When we think about digital and cultural transformation, we think about ourselves as a global company. We think about our global reach. And so for me, that goes both ways. When I tell a story about something that's happened to be a project out of the UK, I want to make sure that the world knows about it and that we're talking about it in multiple languages. And when I find a great story, when we have a great innovation, I'm also really pushing my team to be like, okay, where are the examples in Asia? Where are the examples in Europe? How can we do our storytelling in a way that reflects the global nature of our business? And so, I mean, I think this probably goes without saying more for companies that are based outside the United States than those of us that are based in North America, honestly, but it's just such an important part of digital transformation. We're all living in a very global world now. And if we aren't doing a good job telling people how our technology impacts people around the world, we really aren't successfully completing a digital transformation.
So, Alison, do you do that kind of differentiation, maybe like between the regions, like let's say you're doing something in, I don't know, like Sunbelt or something like that, and then maybe that story is a little bit different than what do you do, I don't know, in Pacific Northwest, maybe same technology, different applications. So how do you focus on or do you focus on the narrative within the country?
Yeah, it's a really good question. We don't do too much localization within US regions, but we do a lot of localization around the world. I recently actually took on global storytelling. So News Center Asia, News Center Europe was part of my remit now. And one of the things we're talking about a lot is, what do our European and Asian audiences need? What are they talking about? What are they worried about? And how do we meet their needs differently? And also, sorry, the Americas as well. And it's been very interesting to talk to our global partners. Folks that are, I know that there's a pretty worldwide audience on this call, folks that are based in Asia. I know there's a lot of conversation right now about how Asia isn't just an engine to produce technology, but really an engine to create technology. So in that part of the world, the storytelling that we do is really about digital transformation as companies transform into becoming digital creators. So we're not just building a computer in Asia anymore, we're really creating the technology behind the computer. And that's the kind of storytelling that we're going to focus on. Another big area of focus for us in Asia is inequality. We're seeing, vast inequality in terms of technology. And so how do we talk? We talk a lot about the stories in which we or our customers or partners are bringing more or sort of closing that inequality gap, whether it's women having access to technology or, some of the class issues that some countries deal with. In Europe, what we really see is that it's much more, it's an area of the country or area of the world where we see a lot of our technologies be implemented early on. So we might focus more on a customer who's doing a really cutting edge scenario, because that's kind of, the customer storytelling opportunity we have there. And that's what resonates in that market. In the Americas, we're really focused on small to mid-sized businesses. That's the opportunity we see there. That's some of the really interesting storytelling we have to do there. And so that's the focus. So I would say, to answer your question kind of with a different tone, it's not so much that we think about regional differences in the United States. To some degree, we might. It's more about how do we think about how do we effectively reach global audiences in a way that resonates with them. And then there's stories like this one. I would say Code Jumper is just going to be interesting to anybody around the world. So, that's a story where we can just translate it into 28 languages and frankly, we'll get picked up. Does that answer, or not really answer, but does that explain what I mean?
No, it's pretty good. Thank you.
Any other questions on global before I move on?
I think we're good.
Okay. So I feel like when I talk about this is the point where people are looking at me like, well, that's great. Allison, you're a former journalist, you work at Microsoft, you have all this, resources, but how would I possibly do this? And so before we move into our breakouts, what I really want to do is talk a little bit about how you can do this kind of storytelling, even if you don't have a huge communication shop or you don't have a bunch of former journalists working for you like we do here at Microsoft. I think there's some really simple steps. There's some really low budget things that you can do, honestly. And first and foremost, what I would say about this kind of storytelling is the best thing you can do is set yourself up for success. So, depending on where you are in the company, whether it's marketing, sales, communications, if somebody comes to you and says, I have this really cool thing that I'm doing, and you go through that checklist that we talked about earlier, and you're like, wow, it really does accrue to all of our goals here. Really think about the storytelling from the beginning. So the second that I get wind from anybody in the company about a new technology that's coming up or, a big announcement we're going to make, I start trying to get them to think about storytelling. I'm asking them, who's working on this? Are there any interesting personalities? Can we bring a diversity of voices in? So instead of talking just to the executive behind the project, can I get out there and actually talk to the people that are developing it, some of the entry-level employees that are working on this technology? I'm really kind of like persistent about making sure that they're including me as they go along. And this can be 6 months or a year before an announcement. I mean, there's plenty of announcements that we work on for a really long period of time, but the important part is that they're communicating with me from the beginning, or that if I get wind of it, I'm pushing them more likely, honestly, because they're very busy, to make sure that they're thinking about like, oh, how are we going to tell this story? Should we embed a reporter in with the team? Should we just check in every few weeks and see what's going on? And then really importantly, are we thinking about visual storytelling? So we're going to talk a little bit more about this later, but your story isn't going to go anywhere unless you can amplify it on social media, with journalists, wherever. And what that means is great visuals, whether it's still photography or videos or graphics. And in order to get good visuals, you have to literally be there. This is a challenge with COVID. It's not been easy for us, but this picture here is an example of where these researchers went out into the desert to test a model of how they could make this sailplane, this like sort of model airplane thing, fly like a bird without a motor, pick up on like, the air currents. And obviously we have to be there in the desert with them in order to get those visuals. And if we hadn't started talking to them 6 months earlier and we hadn't pressed them, like, when are you going out? Where are you going? Can we be there? How do we get access? We wouldn't have gotten these pictures and we wouldn't have been able to tell that story in a really compelling way. This may sound obvious, but being authentic and telling the truth is really important. It's tempting, and we see it all the time. It's tempting for people to kind of gloss over. And I find that when people tell me about their story, they want to put their best foot forward, right? They want us to cover their piece. But we have to acknowledge flaws. We have to acknowledge weaknesses. We have to acknowledge that cutting edge technology isn't perfect. So not only do I push people of like, accuracy needs to be our top priority, but I also explain to them the value of being authentic. In this same story, we were actually out there with a New York Times reporter, with a photographer, with me and some communications people, and the experiment didn't work. It was the first time we were trying it. It didn't work. It didn't impact our coverage. Our coverage was still strong because we got a lot of credit for trying something new. So that's an example of where being authentic can really pay off. If we'd been out there with a reporter and we were trying to hide it, like, oh, things are going fine, when you can see the frustration on these people's faces, that wouldn't have worked for us. I also just don't think it's what the world expects from us today. I say we live in a world in which celebrities are sharing like their therapy sessions, what they ate for breakfast, like, there's a lot of oversharing happening in the world. And while I don't recommend that you do that kind of storytelling, I do think it's important that you reflect the authenticity of the moment right now. People don't want perfect, glossy stuff from us. They kind of want the imperfection. When we interview people and they try to like adjust their quotes so that they sound better, we're like, you know what? You sound like a human being. Let's leave the quote the way it is. Let's leave that imperfection in. Let's show people that we're human beings. And again, that's part of, for Microsoft at least, both the digital and cultural transformation of where we're at. We're just very comfortable with the idea that change happens in ways that are not always perfect, that there's some trial and error there.
Yeah, and I think it's really important. We have been discussing the building the culture before that, and that's one of the ways. If employees see that on that level, on the corporate level, you talk about those, I wouldn't call the failures, but attempts, right? Attempts to lead that perfection. That just builds that comfort on the organization level and the culture that it's okay that new things don't work. It's okay to keep trying on those new things. It's okay to go and ask for help, right? And that's effectively builds that culture, and it builds that comfort with people with those new changes, and sometimes those changes don't work.
It's such a good point. And I mean, I see it myself as a manager, right? As soon as I model that, as soon as I'm like, wow, I tried this and it didn't work very well, so I'm going to try a different thing, or even ask like my team, like, hey, what do you guys think? The more likely they are to be honest with me and come to me and be like, I tried this and it didn't work, or I'm really having trouble with this. And that's how you actually get solutions. So, I mean, it's pretty amazing. Like once you kind of make yourself vulnerable and say things like that, the way that it really ripples across your team, which writ large sort of, I think, gives your company a lot of credit. Any other questions on this one before I move on? All right.
How do you really see your role? So your role is much more an enabler, yeah? You putting you identify the right projects, you put professional resources in it, and make sure that a story is from the very beginning uncommunicated in a very professional way. Or I mean, it's a quite interesting approach, because it's not like the typical communication approach. It's like your newspaper redaction team within the company, and try to pick up the best stories and try to give them visibility. It's never expected such an way from a company like Microsoft. I was thinking it's much more hierarchical and complex to much more top-down communication approach, but you have a lot of freedom, and you can pick what you think is the best one, or is it in collaboration with
Yeah, I mean, like, you asked a good question, like we're definitely making sure that we're, mapping to the top comms priorities, but we are looking for those opportunities for the type of storytelling we do, right? So a lot of folks will come to me with like, oh, we're announcing a new laptop. And it's like, great, that's an announcement, not an opportunity for journalism style storytelling about digital transformation. So I'm like, nice try, like, let's talk some more. And like, this is actually a real example. The team that does Surface, our hardware, came to us in the spring or in the fall and was like, we're announcing new laptops. I was like, great, good luck to that, and they were like, okay, well, what can you do with us? And I was like, well, tell me more about what you're doing. And so we kept talking, and they said, oh, well, we've got this one thing, it's kind of cool. We're going to have a mouse that's made out of plastic we found in the ocean. And I was like, oh, okay. And they were like, yeah, it actually turns out it's like really hard to take plastic bottles out of the ocean and make them hardy enough to make a mouse. And I'm like, okay, now we're getting somewhere, right? Now we're talking about an element of innovation in our hardware that's kind of unexpected, that's super interesting. We ended up finding these people who in the company, and also with our third-party partner, who were super interested and very willing to talk to us for a very long time about plastic molecules, which I actually found quite fascinating. And so there we got to a story. So I think you're absolutely right. Like, we do have a lot of freedom. We have a lot of responsibility too, right? We got to show results. I've got to show impact. I've got a lot of data that I got to show that, we drew traffic. I've got to show that we saw earned pickups, so journalists pick this up. I do a lot of looking at message pull through, how many of our photos were used, how many times did our quotes get picked up in stories. And, so there's accountability there, but we absolutely have built some trust where people do let us choose where in the moment can we engage for maximum impact. And so in that example, it was big announcement about all of our new hardware. We didn't touch the like, here's the new laptop, here's the new specs part of the story. What we touched on and what we focused on was, here's this interesting example of an innovative mouse that's available to the public, and here's how we made it. And it was great. It got us a lot of innovation cred. And again, like, my job is to move the needle on the perception of Microsoft as an innovative company, right? That's what I'm trying to do. And yeah, I mean, I think maybe not 6 years ago when I came here, but now with a track record, we do have a lot of leeway to decide which areas we want to focus on based on what we know will be the most successful with this type of storytelling.
Do you have also, I mean, you focus very much on the people. Do you have also a corporate influencer program? So people who are really talking for the company? So employees, so you have something which you combine with your more media communication?
Yeah, so we do, I mean, as a company, like most companies, we do have, trained spokespeople. For the journalism style storytelling, we do talk a fair amount to executives. I work a lot with executives to decide on the top priorities of the story, but we really try to feature the voices of people who are not trained spokespeople in our story. And the reason is that we're a safe space for them, right? They interview with our company, folks. We can work with them. We can make sure that, they are, we're choosing the elements that adhere to the message. But what that gives us is some authenticity. It gives us the opportunity to talk to people who are really working on the product at the ground level. It gives us the opportunity to hear from a diversity of voices at our company, to hear from future leaders and to feature them and to get their work picked up. And it just gives us the ability to see the story beyond what the high level executive level would be. So our executives have a really clear understanding of our goals. They have a really clear understanding of our product line. They're fantastic to work with and they're eminently quotable. What they don't know is how the sausage was made, right? So if I want to do a story about how that ocean plastic mouse is getting made, I can't go to the CVP of hardware. Like, that person did not spend hours and hours of his life looking at resin and trying to figure out like which resin would work. And again, I think it's an opportunity for diversity and inclusion, in the technology industry, as in most industries. We don't have as much of a diversity of voices in our higher ranks. So bringing in some of the folks from the lower ranks of the company, some of the people that are more entry level who are working on the projects, not only gives us a more interesting perspective, but it also showcases some of the folks that are contributing to some of this digital and cultural transformation by bringing a diversity of voices that we in the technology company industry have not always had.
So a really interesting question from Mohammed. Is that authenticity and easiness with imperfection to what end? When do you know to pull the flag?
It's more of an art than a science. It's a really good point. I would say at the end, our story needs to have a success, right? Like, we don't do stories about not having learned something. We don't do stories about we're really about the trial and error that leads to the impact. So we definitely have had, it's rare that we just like don't do a story at all, but we'll often have a story where we'll say we're not ready to tell it yet, right? We don't have the breakthrough yet. And we want to document that trial and error because it shows the resilience, it shows the hard work. But yeah, definitely if it's like, and then in the end, we didn't release the product. No, that's not a story we're going to tell. But like with our storage on glass piece, it was like, the story has been, we're trying this. We know a little bit, but we don't know enough to make it a marketable product. Another area where I think we kind of walk that fine line is with our sustainability, our data center sustainability work. So for example, I don't know, maybe 6 months ago or so, we did a story about liquid cooling. So one of the obvious big challenges of data centers is cooling them. And we've got some prototypes in place. And we wanted to showcase that because we're ahead of others in the industry around how we can use some alternative forms of cooling that are more eco-friendly and use less water or other resources. But we had to be very clear. Yes, we're out front on this, but no, we don't have a marketable, cost-effective solution yet. So that's an area where I think we're comfortable talking about an incremental step because we want to show that we're leading on innovation, but we have to be very careful because we don't have a marketable solution. We think we will, and we'll get there and we'll keep talking about it, but not yet. And so I guess that's another thing I can say. We're comfortable talking about not being successful yet if we know we will be successful in the future, if we have a roadmap that shows us. So often when we tell a story, we're holding back. We know we're a little bit further along than we're saying, because we want to, sort of like have a next step to talk about later. Does that answer the question? I know that was a little bit of a fuzzy answer.
No, I think it's good.
It is hard. It's a tough one. And I will say it makes people uncomfortable. It's like, it's an area of work that we, I think I definitely have had the butterflies in my stomach sometimes going out with stories being like, wow, are we doing the right thing? But we've never regretted doing a story.
Awesome. Thank you.
Okay, so the last thing I want to talk about before we move into our breakout rooms is amplification. So as much as I would love it, people don't just wake up in the morning and go to Microsoft Stories and read our pieces. They find us through social media. They find us through journalists. They find us through SEO. They find us through executives sharing our stories. They find us through all sorts of ways. And so the other thing, as you're thinking about storytelling from the beginning, we talked about checking in early. We talked about capturing visuals. It's also important to bring in your amplification partners. And I am pretty shameless in who I will ask to amplify my stories. If I get wind of anybody anywhere in the company who I think might be interested, I will ask them. We tend to build out a pretty extensive social media plan. We start with our brand social partners. We have other social partners at the company. We do ask executives to share on LinkedIn. LinkedIn is a fantastic driver of innovation storytelling page views. We ask if we include an outside company in our storytelling, we ask them to share a story. Your story's not going anywhere unless you find amplification for it. There's a lot of self-fulfilling prophecies around SEO. So if you can get the URL to your story shared with journalists and they link to it, that's going to drive more SEO, which will drive more traffic. I'm not a social media expert, but I will just leave you with the idea that you cannot find your stories to be successful unless you are promoting them in the world. It's pretty uncomfortable for a lot of people. We quote a lot of people in our stories who are introverted and don't feel great. And we have to really coach them on here's a nice, humble way to say what you did and really get the story out, but we want you to share it. And this is, again, where visuals come into play. This is a research project we did a few years ago about using AI to sense things in a space. And, these really close-up visuals really resonated on Instagram. So just a quick example of, thinking about that visual storytelling as part of your amplification. As I said, I'm not an expert in social media, but I'm happy to answer questions about amplification if folks have them. Great. Well, now I think maybe we should do our breakout rooms class. Does that make sense? We've given people kind of an idea and
Yep.
Maybe they can come back with some ideas that we can talk about or workshop.
Yep. Sounds good. That lives about
great.
20 minutes in the session. So how about we give about 7 minutes for everyone to go into the breakout rooms and discuss about the story that you want to share. Who would be the audience and why do you want to share the story? Why it resonates with you? So speaking about that authenticity, is that why do you want to tell that story? So let me go and now break out the room. So now you can join them.
Okay. Sounds good.
All right, awesome. So please go and join your respective rooms and talk about what is the story that you want to talk about and why do you want to talk about this story. All right, please go and join your rooms. Let me go and move you to room 1 and then move to room 1. All right, please go and join your respective rooms. All right. So welcome back, everyone. So does anyone wants to share? What would maybe Allison? How about you start what you discuss in your group, and maybe you can give a little bit of your feedback and your view, and then we can go first.
Sure. Well, I think the topic du jour that came up in our session, which I would love to hear from other folks about, was really about it came up in a couple different ways, was about how the COVID situation accelerated some digital transformation. So, whether it was working from home, having to transition a workforce from home and see that go smoothly, or a transition, Ingy talked about a transition to mobile banking and that kind of pushing people from the status quo of traditional banking to really thinking about these other things. And so, um, it's a really interesting, I was listening to them and I thought it was a really interesting topic. It's one we've grappled with as well. Obviously, nobody would like to live in a pandemic. Um, on the other hand, I think what we have seen as a society around the world is resilience, right? It's really pushed us to adapt. And I think what we've also seen is that the digital tools were in place to allow digital transformation to make people's lives easier amid a pandemic. And so, I mean, that was a theme that I heard. I feel like this is such an interesting theme to explore because, on the one hand, nobody wants to be like, oh, the pandemic was fantastic. But on the other hand, they do think there's an opportunity in a subtle way to do storytelling that focuses on how, we as a company, whether it's a financial services company or a telecom company or a technology company, put some tools in place to make your life easier through a thing that nobody would want to go through.
So
So that was, yeah, go ahead.
so listen, maybe a follow-up question here, because it's a lot of companies, seems to me, will have a common theme, right? So again, like banking and telecom and this and that, they all will kind of have the same story, right? COVID hit, it kind of affected all of us, right? And therefore everyone is talking about.
Yeah.
So how would you say that, how do you pick the edge of the story that is most authentic to
Yeah.
your brand?
Yeah. It's such a good question. I think so I can answer that question by, I guess, talking a little bit about how we approached it. And again, trial and error. At the beginning of the pandemic, I think we thought, oh, we should focus our storytelling on how we can help fight the pandemic. So we had researchers. I showed you that story about Project Natick being used for some data mining about COVID. We talked about how some of the people in our research organization were contributing to some of the biotech research. And we kind of quickly realized, like, why does that matter, right? It wasn't really resonating with our audiences. Because I think people were like, okay, I don't care. Meanwhile, I can't get my kid onto Teams, to go to school. So we really quickly pivoted and we focused our COVID storytelling on the technology tools that people were trying to use in their everyday life and what were the changes we were making to Teams to make it easier for students, to make it easier for educators, to make it a better experience for all of you at home. And then, so I would say that was the second wave. And then the third wave, which we're in right now, was like, wow, we have learned a lot from having so many customers using this technology in a pandemic. And we developed what's called a work trend index. It looks at patterns and themes. We do some research, and it really talks about the human experience of working from home, what it gives to you and what it takes from you. And to get back to that authenticity piece, we've been very honest. There's a burnout factor. Being on camera, me being on camera with all of you for an hour, that's taxing, right? Like it's a different way of interacting with people that doesn't give me nearly as much energy as if I was sitting in a room with you. So I would say right now, what we're focused on is how do we make what will likely always be a hybrid work environment also like a human environment? How do we avoid burnout? We've got tools where you can set your meetings to automatically end 5 minutes before the hour so people can get that break to grab a cup of coffee, go to the bathroom, whatever, check on their kids who might be doing school downstairs. We focused on avatars. So a big announcement we made was how instead of me being on camera like this, I could be an avatar, which would give me a little bit of that break from the pressure of being a face on a camera, but also allow me to have a human connection with you. So that's kind of a long story, but that's kind of how we've, I think,
Awesome.
approached COVID storytelling. I don't know if other folks have, with only a few minutes left, maybe somebody else wants
Yeah.
to share.
Please go ahead. What did you discuss in your groups that will talk about the what is the story that you want to tell and why?
Any volunteers? I'm happy to call in people too. I mean that way.
Mohammed, please.
Well, yes, it was me, Dagbert and Kamal. I shared the story about our organization. I work at Vodafone in Egypt, the mobile telecom provider. The story I want to share with you guys is it was around 3 years ago when we won a tender with the government for the development of what we call the UHI, Universal Health Insurance, which is similar to the NHS in the UK. Because the healthcare system in Egypt has been a mess for the past 30 or 40 years. So we won the tender.
You're talking to Americans,
digitize.
Remember that, right?
Yeah.
On a relative scale, yeah.
It's a little bit different. You haven't seen the one here, so
yeah.
We won the tender to digitize the healthcare system in Egypt, and what we did is that we hammered on how important is that to the population, and how important is it for us, of course, as a company, because it's part of our strategic. One of our strategic objectives was digitizing Egypt. So whenever we have the chance, we brag about that project. How are we going to help the government? How are we going to transform the healthcare in Egypt? And actually, that helped us in winning other tenders in other aspects or other businesses, whether from the government or from the private sector. So I would second what you were saying, Alan, about that we need to not to keep our digital transformation for ourselves, that we need to brag about it and we need to talk about it to the public.
Yeah, I love too how you went to the exact right place, which was focusing on the impact on people. So nobody really cares about, like, whether you use a new technology or whatever. I mean, some people might, but what your customer really cares about is, like, now I have a better healthcare experience. Now I can access my records online. I don't have to go in. Whatever the impact is on a human being, that is always going to be more impactful and more effective storytelling than, like, whatever technology behind the scenes was used.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
Awesome. Anyone else want to go for their last one?
Well, if not, thank you so much to all of you for having me. It was fun. I really appreciated all the great questions. And yeah, it's always interesting to learn from people about their process.
Awesome.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very, very much. Have a wonderful rest of your day. Thank you.
Thank you.
Right.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.